Hey Pioneers, welcome to episode number 455. I'm going to be sharing with you today the things that I started doing differently that completely changed my journey with sourdough, in the hopes that it will also have the same benefit and effects on you and your sourdough journey. I feel like sourdough is one of those things that you really either love and you want to do it and you're intimidated, or you've tried it and you've had failure and you're like, I really don't get what everybody's talking about. Like, this doesn't work for me. I went through a ton of flour, or it was super time consuming and I didn't get the results that I wanted. Those kind of seem like the three scenarios that I hear, and I have been in all three of those places. So I wanted to just walk you through what my journey with sourdough has looked like and where I've landed today, to give you some hopes and some pointers so that you also can be at that place where you're like, sourdough is awesome and amazing, and it doesn't take a ton of time or a ton of flour, and I get the predictable, I think that's key, awesome results no matter what type of sourdough recipe I'm making every single time. So sourdough is 100% worth it. For those of you who are like, I don't really know, is it like really all it's cracked up to be or not? I want to rest assured it is absolutely worth it. It's the way historically people have been making bread really since the dawn of humanity, because we only have what we know as our little instant yeast packets now since about the 1940s. Prior to that, you were pretty much using sourdough or making other forms of homemade yeast. Sourdough is one of the most universal and easy ways to capture the yeast and the bacteria that are already naturally in the environment. And you're basically creating this really nice little environment for them where they're all happy, like this little home for them. And then they will proliferate and become this wonderful culture that we call sourdough. So one of the reasons sourdough is so amazing is not just because it cuts out the need for us to buy yeast. And for those of you who have ever bought yeast, you know that it can get a little bit picky on its storage sometimes, especially if you're buying it from the store in packets and it's been in the store for a while. You probably have had failures with that yeast where it was old and it had expired. It can have a shorter shelf life. Now, storing it in the fridge or the deep freezer until you're ready to use it can definitely help expand that. So for those of you who still have some yeast recipes and are like, I'm still using my yeast, just a little quick tip there. But one of the reasons that sourdough is so awesome, and when we use commercial yeast, we lose these benefits, and that is because the actual fermentation process that happens while the yeast and the bacteria inside the sourdough culture are fermenting. So what happens is the starch that is in the flour begins to be consumed by the yeast and the bacteria. Why that is so great is, one, is it increases the ease of digestibility. So that's why a lot of people who have some types of gut issues, especially gluten sensitivities, are able to eat true sourdough, meaning that it is a ferment and it uses 100% sourdough as the leaven in it, the leavening ingredient. I have seen a lot of, sadly, most commercial sourdough breads from a lot of bakeries and anything pretty much you're buying at the store sourdough wise will use some sourdough starter for flavor, but they're also using instant yeast. They're not a true long ferment, fully cultured sourdough product. So for most folks, unless you happen to have an awesome, amazing bakery near you that actually does true sourdough baking, the only way to get sourdough is to make it at home. So back to the fermentation that happens there and why that is so incredible. So it helps with the digestion because that yeast and bacteria is breaking down the starch. They're consuming that. That's what's helping them to grow, but they're pre-digesting it for us. So it's kind of that prebiotic stage. That means that when we eat it, our body it's easier to digest. And we're able to absorb a lot more of the nutrients that are already in the flour than you can without having that long ferment. So it's easier to digest, and your body can actually absorb the wonderful nutrients that are in there in comparison to non-cultured or non-sourdough. The other neat thing about sourdough, and this is true of most ferments, is because the starch part, the carbohydrate part, has been consumed by these live microorganisms, it is a lower glycemic index, meaning it doesn't spike your blood sugar nearly as much. It helps that stabilize. And as most folks know, right, that's a good thing. Lower glycemic index and the less spiking we have of insulin response and blood sugar responses is a definite good thing. So you get so many benefits when it comes to sourdough. It is definitely something you want to start working into your system. Now, oftentimes I hear people, and I completely understand it because I was there too, that it can be super time consuming, especially if you are not home during the day, if you have an outside job or you work off of the homestead. There are a lot of people like, I just don't have time. Like, I'm not there. Do I have to bring my sourdough starter with me to work to do things? And there are so many ways, and I'm going to share that with you today, that you can fit sourdough into whatever your schedule is. It should not be super time consuming. That's kind of the beauty of sourdough once you get that rhythm down. So there's also the fear of wasting ingredients. And I have found that the wasting ingredients is a true thing, depending on how you're trying to maintain and create your starter. So one of the things that I started doing differently is I do not keep a large amount of starter on hand. The max amount that I keep of a sourdough starter is half a cup. The only time I keep a larger volume is when I simply am feeding it in order to make a recipe. So I'm not storing and maintaining a large amount of sourdough starter. That way, I'm not going through mass amounts of flour, and it actually creates a healthy, more vibrant sourdough starter, which is going to help you when it comes to getting that great texture that you want on your different breads so that they're not dense. And it also helps to not have such a strong, tangy sourdough flavor if that's not something that you want. So all of these things are controlled in the way that you feed your sourdough starter. And I'm going to be doing an in-depth training coming up this January 27th, which is 9 easy tips for sourdough to bake like a pro at home. So this is going to be full depth training, totally free, on sourdough starter, including the number one mistake that kills most sourdough starters and how to avoid it. My foolproof feeding schedule, that was a tongue twister, that fits seamlessly into even your busiest lifestyles, and how you can create a bubbly, creamy dome starter no matter what your climate is like. And if you're like, I don't even know what that means, you are definitely going to want to make sure that you sign up for this live training that I'm going to be doing. I usually only do this once a year. To register for this class, go to melissaknorris.com/sourdough class. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, you can simply go beneath in the video description. We'll have a link there. Or if you're on the website watching this, obviously we'll have a link there for you as well. Okay. Back to today. So when I first started trying to do sourdough, this was like 20 years ago, and I followed a recipe that called for, which was first major mistake, using a packet of store-bought yeast, flour, water, and sugar. And you combined all of this into a jar, and it said to just let it sit on the counter for 7 days. Well, I came back to a science experiment gone horribly wrong. There was all the colors of mold, rainbow, that you could imagine growing in this jar. It was disgusting. So threw that out. And then I think it was probably like another almost 10 years before I tried to do sourdough again. At that point, I did create a sourdough starter, but I really didn't understand how to read the sourdough starter. And I was trying to keep way too large of a volume of sourdough starter. And so it was okay in discard recipes for the most part for things like sourdough pancakes or sourdough waffles, because you were putting syrup on them, right? Like you were putting sweet things on them. They didn't need to have the rise, because with discard recipes, you are normally adding a little bit of baking powder, baking soda. It's recipes that wouldn't require yeast anyway. So usually those will turn out okay if your sourdough starter isn't really at its peak. Where the trouble really came in, however, was when I tried to bake bread with it. And I'm pretty stubborn. And so I'm like, I'm just going to keep going with this. And so I will never forget, I was so frustrated. This was like the straw that broke the camel's back when it came to my sourdough journey. So I had mixed up the bread dough, and I was an experienced bread baker with regular yeast. So I knew the signs to look for as far as when it's actually risen enough so that it's not overproofed or underproofed in order to bake things. I knew how to do window pane and kneading and all of those types of things. So I had made up, my kids, they were little at this point, and they really wanted sandwich bread. And I wanted it to be 100% sourdough for all of the health reasons that I just mentioned before. So I mixed up, followed the recipe to a T, which can happen with sourdough. You can be following the recipe and the measurements to like with a scale degree. And if that sourdough starter is not actually happy, if it's sluggish, you still won't get a good end result. So I mixed this sandwich loaf up, did all of the kneading, the first rise for however many hours. It was like 7 hours, and it didn't rise very much at that point. And so then I'm like, okay, well, it's been like 7 hours. I'm going to go ahead and form my loaf, put it in this in the loaf pan, and let it rise again for the second rise. Because with sourdough, it's always a lot longer rise time. If you're used to yeast baking and you're like, oh, well, it usually only has to rise for maybe an hour to 2 hours max. Sourdough is longer than that. And I remember still to this day looking at this loaf pan. And at this point, it is like, I think it was like 10:30 at night. And I had calculated out beforehand that I should have been able to bake it at like 8 o'clock at night in order to pull it out of the oven in time to go to bed and have it for the next day. So it's like 10 o'clock at night, and like this thing has not risen hardly at all. And I knew that it hadn't risen enough to bake it, but I'm like, I don't have any more time. We need to have bread in the morning. I don't have time to bake bread in the morning before leaving for work. And so I'm like, maybe it's going to be one of those types of recipes where you put it in the oven and it has incredible oven spring when it meets the heat. I was optimistic. So I put this loaf in and bake it. And of course, it does not rise at all in the oven. I mean, maybe like a quarter of an inch, right? Super small amount. There was not any great oven spring. And we pull it out, and I'm just mad at this point. So I pull it out and I'm like, ugh. And I'm like, okay, well, it's going to be more like a flatbread. It's going to be dense, but I'm just going to slather on the peanut butter and the jelly, and we're going to call it good. And so I slice into it and ended up putting on some, like I was just going to eat a piece, right, just to kind of test it. It was the most sour, and not in a good way. Now, I love a good tangy sourdough bread, actually. I'm fully on for it. I like the flavor of fermented and culture foods. But it was sour, like it was gross. And I'm like, my kids are not going to eat this. Like, there is literally no point in putting it in their lunchbox. Like, I have just wasted all these ingredients. I've wasted all this time. And now I don't have any bread for their lunches tomorrow. They're going to have to do hot lunch. I was so mad that I was like, this is not worth it. I'm going back to yeast. And so it was at least a couple of years before I was like, okay, if humans from way back have been doing sourdough, surely you can figure it out. So that's when I really sat down and studied sourdough and did a ton of research on it, and then started working with it to come up with a system that I have now, and that I've had thousands of students go through the sourdough training and also had success, with many of them being exactly how I was like, I've tried it before and it didn't work. So if you don't have a sourdough starter, like brand new, I highly recommend that you sign up for the sourdough class that I'm teaching on Monday. There will be a replay that goes out. I know everybody's schedule is different, because that's going to really walk you through how to create a successful sourdough starter, or if you have a sourdough starter that's being a little bit sluggish. So I'm going to go back to here though, where we're going to be starting small with a volume of sourdough starter, and why that has been really key for me. So the smaller amount of culture that you're starting with means that there's actually more food available for that culture to be able to consume and eat. Because if you have a sluggish starter, it means it's not being fed correctly, that those organisms aren't being fed. I mean, think about people, right? If you have someone who's really malnourished, they are not going to be able to perform athletically at all, in comparison to someone who is getting proper nutrition. They're in a good environment, all of those things. Well, these cultures are the same way. So if your starter is not performing the way you want, if your bread is not rising the way that you want, especially if it's taking forever and it's really, really dense, the most likely culprit is your sourdough starter culture is not where it should be. And by keeping a lower volume of starter, actually, in my experience, makes a better environment for the bacteria and the yeast to be able to proliferate and have enough food to be at their peak. The other thing is feeding it consistently. Now, this is true with a brand new starter. So I'm going to be going over this in detail in the class with a brand new starter. What's called, I had like a fun accent there. Starter, not starter. I don't even know what I was saying. I get so excited. You are going to have if you have a brand new immature sourdough starter, that is going to be the class that you want to attend for sure next week. However, if you have a mature sourdough starter, and kind of for mature sourdough starter, I'm talking a sourdough starter that's at least 4 weeks, a month, or older, then you can use the system that I'm talking about now. But oftentimes people will try to start a brand new starter and they try to treat it like a mature starter and don't understand why they're having problems. However, if you have a mature starter that's had issues, I recommend going back to how you treat it when it's in its infancy in order to get it back to a place of strength. So feeding your sourdough starter consistently is one of the biggest tips that I can give you, aside from starting small with a small volume. So feeding it consistently is going to be key, and it also can make it easier on you as well. If you are keeping your mature sourdough starter at room temperature, which if you're baking with it or you cooking with it every single day, then you would keep it on the counter and at room temperature. However, if you are not baking with your sourdough starter or cooking with your sourdough starter every single day, you don't want to be feeding it every single day because that's going to be wasteful both of your time and with your ingredients. So instead, and again, like I really need to stress this part. So if you're busy, hear this part. If your sourdough starter is mature, then you can do what we call the fridge maintenance, where you put it in the fridge because it's a cooler temperature, so it slows down its growth and its need to go through so much food. And you only pull it out when you are ready to bake, and then you will feed it, get it flourishing, warmed up in food, and then you can bake. So what I do now is the fridge method, which means I usually bake once a week. Sometimes I will bake extra if I know I'm going to be really busy the following week if we're going to be traveling or something, which means I only pull my starter out and feed it once every 2 weeks. That means I'm going through way less flour and I'm not spending nearly as much time in it. But here is my key. If you need to feed your starter, because I see so many people who are new with starters are like, oh, I just simply forgot to feed it. And this is a tip that you can use with anything that you need to do, is put it by something that you will habitually see every day. So for me, I'm going to be making coffee every single morning. So if your sourdough starter is at the phase where you need to feed it every single day and you are having trouble remembering to do that, simply put it right by your coffee maker, because that's going to be glaring to you in the morning if you're a coffee drinker. If you're not, what are something that you do every single morning without even thinking about it? Maybe it's setting it by your toothbrush in the bathroom. I mean, it's in a covered jar, right? I don't know what that might be for you. For most people, I'm going to assume it's making coffee in the morning. You might have a slightly different routine, but whatever it is, put the jar there so that you see it and you can remember to feed it if that's something that you're struggling with. That's going to be one of my biggest things, because I see so many people like, oh, I tried doing a sourdough starter and the sourdough starter died. I'm like, how did it die? Well, I forgot to feed it. So that can be a really simple tip. The other thing is how to understand your starter's behavior. So when a sourdough starter is happy and it's flourishing, you're going to see a lot of bubble activity. And especially if you're using store-bought, not fresh ground flour or whole wheat, but bread flour, organic all-purpose flour, rye flour. If you're using those flours, you're going to see a ton of bubbles both on the top of the sourdough starter, and then all alongside the jar, like where you'll see, all throughout. The reason I say that is because if you're using fresh ground flour, some of the ancient grain flours like einkorn or spelt, or even the gluten-free flours, sometimes the bubble pattern's a little bit different with those, where it's still active and healthy, but you won't see quite so many bubbles. So knowing your flour type is a little bit key there. You will see bubbles, just not sometimes as many. So do know your flour type. And in the free class I'm doing on Monday, I go into depth on all the different flour types that you can use, including what gluten-free flours that you can use. So you want to make sure that you've got lots of bubble action. And this is the key for the ready to bake things, that you're using it in place of yeast. So breads that have a rise time where you would be using yeast if they weren't sourdough, is that sourdough starter needs to be rising consistently. Meaning when you feed it, within 4 hours, it should be doubled in size. And it should be doing that on a super consistent basis. If it's not, it just means it's a little sluggish and you need to go back to having it at room temperature. Don't do the fridge maintenance for a little bit and feeding it like it was a new starter for a couple days in a row until it starts behaving that way again. And oftentimes when people are like, well, sometimes my sourdough starter, doesn't double in size until like 8 hours. And might be because your room temperature is a little bit cold, or it might mean that your sourdough starter is a little bit sluggish. So there's also leeway, because with our ferments, temperature definitely does affect it. So I always say, look at the end result. If you are happy with that schedule, you might be like, I feed it in the morning before I leave for work, and when I come home in the evening, then it's doubled and it's in an active state, and then I can make my dough. But then you'll be baking that bread the next day because it'll have to go overnight. If you want to do a single day bake, then that sourdough starter needs to be at the point where it's doubling in size in about 2 hours, which is what mine does. My sourdough starter is super healthy. And so I can feed it. It will have doubled in 2 hours from being fed. I can mix up my sourdough bread and have it do its ferment and then bake it that night for dinner time. And it's risen beautifully. So that's pretty much the strategy that I use for the most part now. Is I pick one day where I will bake all of our sourdough bread needs for the week. So what I do is the night before I plan on baking everything is I pull my sourdough starter out of the fridge, let it come up to room temperature, and then I will feed it enough volume of flour and water to get the amount of volume of sourdough starter that I need for whatever recipes I'm making the next day. So typically I'll need a cup of active fed, meaning it's in its active state of starter, if I'm making one of my round artisan loaves, as well as if I'm doing a single sandwich loaf. So if I know I want to make 2 loaves of bread, and maybe I want to make some rolls or something like that, then I'll know I'm going to need to feed it more the night before so that I have that volume that I need. So what I'll do is I will feed it the night before about half of the volume that I know I'm going to need the next day for the recipes I've already predetermined I'm going to make. Then, as soon as I get up in the morning, I feed it the rest of the amount of flour that I need for that day. And because I fed it the night before and it's had a chance to get super active, when I feed it that morning, within 2 hours, it's doubled. I can make up all of the doughs that I need to, take the small amount that's left in my jar, give it a little bit of feed, and then pop it right back in the fridge. And so I've just found that gives me a great amount of freedom. Now, if there's a recipe throughout the week that I want to make that's like a discard recipe, then I will simply just pull out what I've got in the fridge, feed it some flour and water, and let that sit on the counter for a day or until that evening, whatever it is that I'm making with just the discard, not really worrying if it's in its active state. So I have found it to be incredibly freeing. I use way less flour, and I use my sourdough much more consistently because my results are so consistent. So some of the other things to talk about, and this is where we get more into baking with sourdough, and that is with your sourdough, understanding your hydration. So here, a lot of times you'll hear as you start to look at sourdough recipes where people will start talking about hydration levels. And so what hydration levels mean is it's the percentage of liquid. There's 2 ways it can mean, actually. Let me back that up a little bit. If sometimes you'll see people say 100% sourdough loaf. Sometimes that means that it's all sourdough leavening, meaning it's 100% fermented. There is no commercial yeast put in it. That can be one thing. The other thing that can mean is that it is the equal amounts. So if it's 100%, it's equal amounts of sourdough starter to equal amounts flour. That also can be referred to as a 100% sourdough loaf. You rarely see that in recipes, but it can be something that you'll see in recipes. Usually you're seeing something where it's going to be about a cup of sourdough starter to 3 to 4 cups of flour, which would be about a 25% starter ratio to flour, right? So if your head's swimming, it's totally okay. But just so some of these terminologies, if you've heard them before, you just have a little bit of understanding there. Then you'll talk about hydration levels, and hydration levels can be in regular bread baking, so non-sourdough bread baking, but it's especially talked about a lot with sourdough. And so that is how much ratio of liquid to flour do you have in your recipe? So of course, a sourdough starter is about half liquid and half flour, depending on how you're feeding that when you're measuring and doing your feeding and how stiff you keep your sourdough starter. But let's say approximately, most folks is about a 50 to 50% of your starter. And so when you look at the other ingredients in the bread is the ratio of how much water. A lot of your sourdough breads, if they're like the artisan round ones, only use water. Of course, if you're doing things like sandwich bread, then you are going to have usually some milk or some fat put in there. It's considered an enriched bread that changes the crumb so that we get that soft soft sandwich texture that you're after. Obviously, it's a very different texture than a round sourdough loaf that we think of as like artisan bread that's that more crunchy steamed outside. And has the larger holes inside because it's not kneaded. It's usually a stretch and fold, which creates a different hole pattern in the bread, depending on if you're doing a kneading that most people are familiar with versus a stretch and fold. It just shapes the crumb differently, as well as if you have fat in there, which is considered an enriched dough, that also helps the gluten to develop slightly different. You get different textures as well. So with your sourdough, however, going back to that, especially when you're talking about those round artisan loaves, you'll often see people talking about different hydration levels. So sometimes you'll see, well, they'll be like, oh, this was a 75% hydration loaf, or this was a 80 or a 90, or sometimes 100. 100 is going to be super, super wet. It's going to be really hard to handle. So I personally usually recommend when you're first starting working with that wetter artisan dough, which is what you're going to see with the stretch and folds. It's not the same as if you were doing a sandwich loaf, where you're used to having it be like, oh, it's as smooth as a baby's butt. You don't get that when you're doing those higher hydration doughs. So usually I recommend that people start out with a slightly lower hydration, meaning like around the 75% range when you're first starting out, because it can be really hard to handle those higher hydration percentage recipes if you're not very familiar with working with those types of doughs, which most people aren't, because a lot of the time you're not working with them outside of sourdough and just kind of like normal baking, or at least I wasn't. My mom never did those. I didn't really know anybody that did that type of baking personally until I started on that journey. So most people's experience isn't going to be with those super high hydrations, and they can cause some problems. It just makes it harder. So start on that simpler side. So when you get into your bread baking, that lower percentage is what I would recommend as far as hydration levels. And then I like to start out with where you're using about a cup of sourdough starter to like about that 25%. Some of my recipes are formulated a little bit differently, but you'll generally see that. I've just found that is a really good general spot that works for most people, especially for the thousands of students that I've had gone through my sourdough course and sourdough lessons and different things like that. Videos, recipes are on the website. That seems to be kind of the sweet spot for people to really get a good foundation and then start to branch out. Now, as I said, now I usually am only doing about a once a week baking. So depending on what we're having for the week, usually what I'll do is at least one artisan loaf, because that's kind of my husband and I's preference. And I got to tell you, I love doing the score patterns. Like, it is this creative outlet. I mean, I've been doing it goodness, now 12, 15 years, I think, as since I started having success and have continued on from the break I had there when things didn't work out so well. And I still get excited. Like every time I'm like, ooh, I want to try this, or I want to try this pattern. Like it is such a creative outlet. It is so fun. So I love doing the score pattern. So we usually do one artisan loaf. And then depending on if the kids are home, and kind of what we've got going on, if they're going to be at home eating a lot of their meals, then I'll usually do a sandwich loaf. My daughter prefers the sandwich, softer style loaves. My son kind of goes either way. He doesn't really mind. And then it'll be if we're having, for like we're doing hamburgers, then I'll make some sourdough hamburger buns at the same time. So I like to use the batch method really, which you'll see as a theme throughout a lot of what I do in the kitchen for the week. So I prefer to do everything on one day where I've got space. And I just will prep everything that we need for that week, get it all done there. And so that's kind of what I've really been doing with our sourdough now, as far as scheduling. And so I don't do like daily bakes or things like that. So I just keep a small amount in my sourdough starter and I keep it in the fridge, bring it out once a week. And that has greatly made me more consistent with baking our sourdough. It made it more enjoyable for me and really reduced the amount of waste that I had when I was trying to maintain this much, much larger sourdough starter. So I want to thank our sponsor of today's podcast, which is Azure Standard. And Azure Standard is where I get all of my flour. So when it comes to baking sourdough, most of the time if I'm doing bread, I will use organic, unbleached always. Doesn't matter what type of flour I'm buying. I always go for organic and unbleached. But I usually will use bread flour or all-purpose. Both of those work really well. All-purpose, hence, obviously its name there. When I am milling flour and doing fresh ground, I predominantly use hard white wheat and a mixture of spelt when it comes to bread. And that's mainly because spelt is great. It's an ancient grain, but it doesn't like to rise up. It tends to have a tendency to want to go a little bit flour. And I like height, I like some height on my bread. And so I found for me, I like to do a mixture with the hard white wheat and the spelt so that I still can get the that lift from the hard white wheat because it has a higher gluten. Spelt is an ancient grain, and so it does contain gluten, but it's a different form of gluten than what we have in today's modern wheat. And I've got episodes on that where we can, if you're curious about that, as far as einkorn, spelt are ancient grains, with the chromosomes, look at that when they split, how their protein and gluten content are different. Like if you want to get geeky in it, which I think is totally fun, I've got some episodes on there. But I found just kind of for my general ease of doing things, I tend to use the spelt and the hard white wheat mixture when I'm doing fresh ground flour. And I get all of those, including my wheat berries and my flour from Azure Standard. And I do like the Azure, they have lots of different brands, but I do actually use the Azure specific brand of the organic unbleached all-purpose flour as well as their bread flour. Those are the two that I get from them because they do carry a couple of other brands of organic unbleached all-purpose flour, etc. But I get their Azure brand, and I have been for, oh goodness, probably at like 6 years now. That's pretty much our exclusive flour source. So they've got lots of things for your baking and your pantry. And if you use coupon code Melissa15, that's coupon code Melissa15, you'll get 15% off your first time customer order of $100 or more. Okay, for our verse of the week, we are in Proverbs 4. And I'm going to go from Proverbs 4, chapter 4, verse 5 through 7. And this is the Amplified translation of the Bible. He taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words, keep my commandments and live. Get skillful and godly wisdom, get understanding, discernment, comprehension, and interpretation. Do not forget and do not turn back from the words of my mouth. Forsake not wisdom, and she will keep, defend, and protect you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is get wisdom that is skillful and godly wisdom. For skillful and godly wisdom is the principal thing. And with all you have gotten, get understanding, discernment, comprehension, and interpretation. I've actually been starting in January going through Proverbs chapter by chapter, because there's 31 Proverbs, right? 31 chapters, I should say, excuse me, way more than 31 Proverbs, 31 chapters in Proverbs and 31 days in January. So at the beginning of January, started going through the book of Proverbs, trying to do a chapter a day. There's been a few days where I have to tell you, I did not get there. So I'll finish it a little bit into February, but it has been so eye-opening. So I would encourage you to spend some time in Proverbs this year. I have found it very beneficial and eye-opening. But one of the reasons that I picked this verse is obviously getting wisdom, right, is something that's smart in all areas of our life. But I actually found this very applicable to what what I was sharing with you today on my sourdough journey, and how we can kind of relate that to probably other things in our lives. So for example, when I first started with sourdough, I had the wisdom, we'll use that in here, of creating a sourdough starter, like understanding very lightly what a sourdough starter was. So flour, water, and the wild culture, which is in the air that we're capturing. It's already on things. It's on the wheat berries. We're just creating that environment. So basically it's just flour and water, but there is the yeast and wild bacteria there. But I didn't have yet, so I had the beginning part of wisdom, right? But I didn't have the understanding and the comprehension and the interpretation fully to understand all of the aspects of that sourdough starter and how it worked in order to create this beautiful sourdough bread time and time and time again. And so there's so many things that I can now look back on my life, or maybe in certain situations with things I'm dealing with, and maybe this is the same for you, where we kind of have that beginning part and we're on the right track, but we don't have the full depth yet of discernment, comprehension, interpretation to a deeper level. But the beautiful thing is God promises us, if we ask for wisdom and seek him, that he will grant us wisdom. But we have to be seeking him and listening to him so that we can receive that and that we can hear that. And I think for me personally, that's kind of been an area where I have to be honest, I'm like, I have not been seeking like I should lately. I've not been sitting and waiting and even being in a position where I could hear the small, still voice of the Lord, because I've simply been too busy running from this thing to that thing and doing other things. So I'm doing a little bit of putting first things first back into my life. And so I invite you to do the same if you're at a place of needing to do that. So I wanted to just share with you how special the Proverbs have been for me this month, and maybe that can be a place of jumping into for you as well. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. I hope that I get to see you on that live training we're doing. Again, you can go to melissaknorris.com/sourdough class and get registered for that. And I'll be back here with you next week. Blessings and mason jars for now, my friends.